Hello, everyone. You've just entered the OsteoBoston zone, and we're excited tonight to have a wonderful speaker. And if you're new to OsteoBoston, I just want to thank you for getting on tonight, and also to our OsteoBoston members that are part of our organization. I want to thank you. I also want to thank those of you that are in New Mexico from the Osteoporosis Foundation of New Mexico that join us tonight. And as well as I'd like to thank our speaker, Sarah Mapes. If you are listening on YouTube, we also really appreciate you, and please give us feedback, either with a thumbs up or comment, or what you'd like to see in the future is really helped along by your participation and subscription. So anyway, without any more to say, I want to bring up Diane.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everybody. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Sarah Mapes. Sarah describes herself as a passionate fitness instructor with nutritional health coach dedicated to improving bone health. She's completed specialized training with Dr. Loren Fishman, a pioneer in yoga for osteoporosis, and is a BoneFit certified instructor. With 20 years of yoga practice and certification as a nutritional health coach from the Institute of Integrative Medicine, Sarah helps individuals strengthen their bodies and enhance their overall well-being through safe, mindful movement and nutrition.
Awesome. Thank you. And welcome, Sarah.
Hello. I'm really excited to be with you.
We're excited to have you, believe
me. So tonight, I'm wondering, let's see. There we go. Now I can see everybody. I'm wondering who has osteopenia and who has osteoporosis in our group. Raise your hand if you have osteopenia. Raise your hand if you have osteoporosis. I'm seeing lots of hands there. Okay. Okay. Now here's my next question for you. Who does yoga? Yes, I'm seeing more hands.
You
That's
kidding
awesome.
me? Used to.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
I used to, and now I don't know what I should or shouldn't do. Yes. Since I had a compression fracture.
Yes. I think that's a really important thing to consider. So with yoga, the first thing that I would like to talk about is actually safe movement. So I'm going to scooch this desk back here a little bit, and I have my mat set out.
Good.
All right. And then from here, I'll move the desk chair out of the way.
What view should I be in? Because I've got people at the bottom of my screen that inhibits my seeing all of you.
Okay.
Oh, Sarah, you need to unmute. I'm sorry.
Thank you. I'm so sorry. I'm going to keep talking and think people are hearing me, and then they're not.
You're fine.
So, yoga has many benefits for bone health, but there are some things that are really dangerous about yoga that we should never do. So one of the first things that I'm going to talk about doing is how would you go about getting down from a standing position down to the floor? And I actually work with people who don't get down to the floor. So know that the important thing is that we're going to adapt movement so that it is safe for your body. Oftentimes I'll use a chair when coming down to the floor, but right now I'm going to come through the hip hinge. So I'm going to make sure that there's room to fold from the hip and to keep my back straight as I make my way down. So coming down here, I'm going to come down and bring one leg down to the floor and then the other leg down to the floor. So that would be how to go about movement and getting up and down in a safe way. If I were to get back up, just going over that Say you're down here in a tabletop position and you're wondering how do you get back up. Then coming back up in a way that keeps your back straight, and then bringing one leg up and then the other leg up. So I think being able to get up and down in a safe way is first off a really important thing. And I love this question that came first off for us this evening. I used to do yoga, but I'm not sure what's safe to do now at this point. So with osteoporosis and compression fractures, there are movements in yoga where we fold forward. And those are movements that you should always avoid. Never do anything like that with osteoporosis. So an example would be, this is what not to do first. Don't do this. So a common yoga pose that people come into would be to come into child's pose. So my knees are together and my feet are together. And then from here, then people come in and they round their spine, just coming in to relax, maybe bringing their forehead down to the floor. Sometimes your arms even come out alongside you, and you just let yourself sort of melt into your mat. This is dangerous if you have osteoporosis. With osteoporosis, we want to keep the spine from coming into this rounded shape. So a way to adapt this would be, instead of having your knees together, take your knees out to the sides and then with your feet together, and then come to sit back into your heels. So coming into a wide leg child's pose instead, coming to sit back, and then don't take your arms back behind you. By bringing your knees out to the side, this will make it so that there's room to come forward from the hip. Do you see the difference between what my back is doing now and what my back was doing before? Mm-hmm. So then when you take your arms out really long, this creates length and extension through the spine, which is actually a really good movement for bone health. So what we want to avoid is anything that's going to cause the spine to round. So if you're in a standing position, sun salutations are something that people frequently see in a yoga class. And part of a sun salutation would be to come into a forward fold. So instead of reaching your arms up and then coming in and folding forward, at this point, many people would then come down and start rounding their spine, which is what we want to avoid. This is a big no-no. So instead, a way to adapt this movement, when you reach your arms up and then people come into a forward fold, stop at a flat back. This is a really good place to stop and then to adapt this movement in a safe way. So another place that you'll see forward folds really commonly in osteoporosis, not in osteoporosis, in a yoga class, in a regular yoga class that you want to avoid if you have osteoporosis, is to be sitting down on your mat and then to fold over your legs or to have one leg out to the side. Anything that's causing you to fold over your legs that would cause your spine to round, that's something to avoid. So that's actually, I think, the most important thing that we're going to cover tonight is safe movement. This is actually true with bone health in general. When you're looking at osteoporosis, I'm going to come back over a little bit closer to the screen and use my hands as a model. So pretend that my hands are two vertebrae. We're going to talk about different directions that our spine moves. So when we come into this rounded shape, into a forward fold, do you see how there's not very much holding on here and we're far over on this edge? When we come into a forward fold and we have bone loss, the lattice structure that's inside our bones that is holding our bones together, when we've come into a forward fold, it puts a lot of stress, too much stress, and it could lead to having a compression fracture. So one of the things that we often refer to compression fractures as being postural fractures. So say you're sitting in a chair, just like the one that I'm sitting in now, and maybe you're watching something on TV. Maybe you're looking at your phone. So you come down to look at your phone, and then pretty soon we start to droop. and we're folded over and we're in that rounded shape. So if you're reading a book, if you're sitting on your sofa, we want to avoid coming into this rounded shape as much as possible. Avoiding the rounded shape means that we're not putting super stress on our spine that could lead to having a compression fracture. Movements that are really important to do in yoga and every day, our spine is intended to move, and we actually strengthen our spine and maintain the ability to keep moving our spine when we move it in all the directions that are safe to move every day. So the first movement that I want to talk about is extension, creating extension through your spine. Length. I love seeing people reach their arms up. Everybody reach your arms up overhead. Join me in creating some extension through your spine. Creating extension is a wonderful movement for osteoporosis. It helps to create space. Another movement that's really helpful that we do regularly in yoga is lateral or side-to-side motion. So you could do that by holding on to one side of your chair and using your other arm to reach up and over. And this movement, opening up through your side body, is actually really helpful for helping to fight kyphosis. So kyphosis is the permanent rounded over shape. So probably we've all seen somebody who has that permanent shape and they can't straighten up. Their head is permanently forward and they can't straighten up. So in order to help avoid having this happen, or even if you're already in this situation and you have something like this and you can't do something about it, in this posture, it's really, really challenging to reach your arms up over your head. And even if you can do it, there's still pressure that's coming in on your internal organs. But this movement, if you're looking at this particular movement and say you can't get out of this position and you're stuck here, when you take an arm out to the side, what you'll notice, even in that position, is that it takes pressure off of your internal organs. So there are some scientific studies that show that lateral motion, even when a person has permanent kyphosis, that can help to improve their ability to breathe and their quality of life. So as far as movements to do with yoga, extension, reaching your arms up overhead, that's a wonderful movement. And also lateral motion. This is another really important movement. The next movement that I want to talk about are small back bends. So coming back to pretending that my hands are two vertebrae, I'm seeing a comment. How far back should your hands be in relation to your head? Oh, this is a really great question. So this has to do with extension. So you'll notice when I reach my arms up over my head that they're coming about by my ears. That's not necessary. So creating length, you're going to create length and an extension through your spine anytime that you bring your arms forward and up. So oftentimes when I teach a class, I'll say something like, reach your arms up over your head, and people will bring their arms, say, out here. This is a good place to be, and you're working on extension. This is flexibility and mobility that nobody needs to have. It's come from teaching a lot of yoga classes over many years, but it's not an important thing. So to answer your question, just reaching your arms out in front and up. This is going to create a lengthening, getting a little bit taller through your spine, and that's really what we want. Did I answer your question? If not, if you want more detail, keep after me and ask more questions. I'm always happy to answer more questions. Is bending to the side like you showed safe? Yes, it is. It's a safe movement. Moving to the side is without question considered a safe movement. There are studies that show, is side extension okay? Yes. So this is different than coming into a bend. Opening up through your side body, what you'll notice, if you leave your arms down for just a moment and just shift over towards one side, you'll notice that this part of your body opens up. And we want this part of our bodies to open up. All right. Remind me to come back to movements of the spine. But let's dive off here into this place because I think it's actually a really important thing to talk about. So in looking at lateral motion, yes, it is true even if you've had a compression fracture. So in looking at this, what's happening when you're coming into side-to-side motion, this is, I think, a hidden statistic. We hear about hip fractures and we think about hip fractures as being the big bad, and they are. They definitely are. 50% of people who have a hip fracture go into a nursing home and never come out. And out of those and out of the 50% that end up in a nursing home, half of those people, so 1/4 of all of the people who have a hip fracture, die within a year of having had the hip fracture. So we think about hip fracture as being a really serious, big, bad thing, and it is. But there are some hidden statistics with compression fractures of the spine. So when a person has a compression fracture, the statistics bear out that they have another compression fracture on average within about 4.5 to 5 months. There are exercises that we can do to strengthen the extensor muscles of our spine, and we can talk about those tonight and what it means to strengthen the extensor muscles of the spine. So the extensor muscles of the spine are a pair of long muscles that run up and down all along your spine. And we want those muscles to be strong because they're keeping us in this upright position. They're keeping us, every time we sit, from coming into a rounded shape. They're protecting our posture. And that's why they help to reduce the risk of pressure. Sarah, don't worry about, oh, okay. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. I love questions, and I'm like watching the chat.
You're
Like,
okay.
let's
Yeah.
go here. Let's go here.
Well,
Okay.
I just want to give you a chance to say what you want to say because we'll ask you.
I wanted to talk about safe movement first, and then the things that yoga has to offer. But this is actually, I think, a really important rabbit hole that we've gone down, looking at side-to-side movement and the reasons why it's so important. So looking at compression fractures, the hidden statistics with compression fractures, and the reason why compression fractures are actually a really serious thing are because when we have a series of compression fractures, then we start to lose height. There are other reasons for losing height. You could have degeneration between your discs. There are a myriad of reasons why that can happen. But a series of compression fractures can eventually lead to losing height and having the bones compress in on themselves and causing permanent kyphosis. So when we're here in this shape, this is the hidden problem with having compression fractures. When it leads to this shape, what's happening is that it's harder to breathe. There's pressure that's continually there on your lungs and on your heart, and it makes it harder to breathe. And so that's why lateral motion, moving side to side, is a safe movement and a really important thing to do. For people who have permanent kyphosis, meaning they can't ever straighten out, they're stuck in that position. There are scientific studies that show that this particular movement, whether you're involving your arm or not, maybe you have two weights down at your sides and you're just shifting over towards one side and then the other. When you do that, that movement from side to side opens up this area. It takes pressure off of your lungs. It makes it easier to breathe. So it is appropriate if someone has already had a compression fracture, it is appropriate for preventing kyphosis, even if you already have kyphosis. The lateral movement is absolutely a safe movement and a really important one to do. Did that answer your question?
Good. Yeah, that's great. Excellent.
So I am not aware of lateral compression fractures. Just sticking to this. The next movement that we were going to talk about are back bends. And so when you think about a back bend, so we've come forward and we know that this is not okay. And you'd think that coming into a back bend that it would be the exact same story, right? You would think that would be what would seem reasonable. But it's not the case. And there's a reason for that. All up and down our backs, we have these little bones that stick out. And these little bones, it's called the spinuous process. And these bones are running all along the back part of our spine. They're where our spinal column is running. They're where nerves are held and run in and out. So there's something really interesting about this bone, the spinuous process. Did you know that it actually continues to grow throughout your life?
No.
Interesting.
Wild.
So these bones continue to grow throughout our lives. So maybe you've watched, maybe when you were a child, you could lay on your tummy and bring your feet to your head. I have a daughter who does that, and I look at her and I just think that's gotta hurt. And she's like watching TV and playing, and she thinks it's fun. And I'm like, I never moved like that. But there are many children who do. And it's because this bone isn't very big and it hasn't grown a whole lot. But throughout our life, this bone will continue to grow and it starts to limit our ability to move. So there aren't compression fractures that tend to happen going backwards. There's one exception to that. There's one group of people who have compression fractures going back. They are circus performers and contortionists. They are the only group of people who have compression fractures from going back. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. Is that because it's done so many times? Or?
So many times, and they're probably forcing a movement that their bodies shouldn't be in. We're talking about extreme movement, things like grown-ups bringing their feet to their head.
Yeah.
Things like that. So very different when a small child does it than when you see an adult doing.
So a back bend would be okay then.
A back bend is a really good movement to do. Small back bends, nothing extreme. We're not talking about come into a crazy wheel or no feet to head, nothing like that. But small back bends, and I'll come over to my mat and show what those look like. And they can actually be done seated in a chair. I'll show that before I get down to my mat. Small back bends also create extension through our spines, and they're a wonderful way to strengthen the muscles in our back. So small back bends are actually a really good movement, and it's something that yoga is offering. So a small back bend would look like if you're sitting up in your chair, then you're going to lift your heart up towards the sky. A movement that's about that big. That's about what I'm talking about. That is really helpful for creating strength through the muscles in our back. Everybody with me on that? All right, I'm going to show some small back bends that yoga has to offer by coming down to my mat. I'm going to take my microphone back over here. And then we're going to come back, moving safely back down to the floor. I'm going to come down with one leg and then the other leg. Set my microphone off to the side. And then from right here, I'm actually going to come into a tabletop position. And then I'm going to slowly lower myself down onto my arms and then all the way down onto my tummy. So from here, one good option for a small back bend would be to bring your hands right underneath your shoulders. And then from here to lift yourself up coming into a baby cobra. And then from here, you have the option to use your hands to hold yourself up here, or to bring your hands to a hover just off of your mat. So if you can hover your hands, then the muscles that are in your back are doing all of the work to hold yourself up here. And there's something that's really interesting that I'd like to point out here, and that's that in Dr. Fishman's research, he found that there is a window for stimulating new bone growth. And that window is between 12 and 40 seconds. So if you've hit that 12 seconds, then you've had a hold that's long enough to stimulate new bone growth. The ideal time is certainly going to be longer, closer to between 30 and 40 seconds. And then the other part that's interesting is there's not benefit to staying in a pose for longer than 40 seconds. It's better to come out of a pose and to then repeat it a second time than to hold it for a longer period of time. So that's a really interesting thing to consider. So the pose that I just did, coming into a baby cobra, holding a pose like that for at least 12 seconds and then up to about 40 seconds is really good for building strength in our backs. I'm hoping that that's
That's interesting. So in other words, you could, is he saying that you could actually build bone by doing that?
He is saying that you can actually build bone.
Wow.
His rate of building bone is it is slow and it can take a long time. I'm gonna make my way back over to the mat and I want to address that because I think it's a really interesting thing to look at. So we can absolutely build bone. It depends on a person's individual circumstances. Some people are able to build bone. For other people, just holding steady is going to be a major thing. And then for other people, just depending on what they have going on, there might be ongoing bone loss. My mom has had cancer and my mom has to take a medication to keep cancer from coming back. And that medication also causes bone loss. And so for my mom, in her situation, she isn't going to be in a situation where she could, say, reverse her osteoporosis. That's not going to be a realistic thing for her. There are some people that are able to actually reverse having osteoporosis, and that's a really interesting thing to look at. But it is very individual. Some people are going to be able to do that, other people aren't. But coming back to looking at Dr. Fishman's research, Dr. Fishman has found that in doing yoga for osteoporosis, the rate of building bone would be about 0.5% per year. So from one DEXA scan to another DEXA scan over a 2-year period, you should see approximately a 1% increase. And to do this, he has people holding the poses that have been part of his research study for between that 12 and 40-second window. He's not differentiating between what type of pose, how the pose is adapted is what I'm saying. So there are advanced versions of the poses, and then there are very adapted versions of poses that could be done from a chair. And he is not differentiating between who's done it in a chair and who's done it down on the floor in the most advanced way possible. If you're doing these exercises, he is seeing results. So I think that's something that's really important to consider and look at.
Absolutely.
But there are other studies that are outside the realm of yoga. If we were to talk about things like the Lift More study, the Lift More study has people lifting weights and lifting heavy a couple of times a week. And there are some very specific exercises in that study. And that study sees improvement in about an 8-month time period. So with actual weight training, people are seeing a much faster improvement. I think that one of the benefits of what yoga has to offer is that not everyone is able to lift weights and not everyone can lift heavy. And so instead of feeling like there's nothing I can do, then yoga can pick up some of those other places. There's a place to adapt this and to make it work in your body.
Absolutely.
The other thing about Dr. Fishman's research that I think is really important to point out is that for many people, they look at his poses and they think, so he has published research with 12 poses. He actually has ongoing research, and there will be, I think it's going to get published next year, fingers crossed. But when that research comes out, there are actually 2 other sets of 12 poses. So there's quite a variety of things to look at that he has studied scientifically. And at this point, he's been doing this for 19 years. So he has 19 years of research, over 200,000 clinical hours, and he has worked with thousands of women at this point. So what he's looking at this point is a lot more substantial than when his first research project came out. So that's something that I think is worth looking at and knowing too. Looking at bone building and coming back to yoga. Yoga offers a lot of wonderful things for bone building. It offers the opportunity to use your own body weight to build strength. And holding some of these poses that have been scientifically studied does have the opportunity to build bone. It is slow, it is gradual, but it is not high impact. and it is accessible and can be adapted, even if you can't get down to the floor, even if you've had a knee replacement, even if you've had a hip replacement, even if you've had fractures. There's a way to adapt it to make it work in your body. Dr. Fishman actually has a registry. If you were to go to his website, I think his website is sciatica.org. And if you were to search teachers in my area, you might be able to find someone who's done his teacher training close by you, which is, I think, a real opportunity. I'm hoping that's okay that I shared that, Shelley.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that would be somebody's question in a second anyway. So that's great.
Yeah. So there's a way to hopefully find a teacher that's by you. Wonderful. So there's another movement that I think is full of questions to talk about, and I would love to talk about it and address it tonight, and that's twisting and osteoporosis, to do it or to not do it. And if you're not familiar with Dr. Fishman's research, then you would probably never do it. But if you've seen his research, then you might think, well, what about twisting? Well, is there a conflict? Well, I've heard from the National Osteoporosis Foundation that I shouldn't twist, that I should avoid it. Oh, kindly put it in the link. Okay, so it flashed up and then it flashed back. I'm not looking. The glasses are off. Sorry.
Don't worry. We'll try to find those things for people.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So I would love to talk about twisting. Is it a safe movement? Is it a not safe movement? Are there people who should avoid it? What's the deal with twisting? So I would love to talk about twisting. I was very curious about this topic because Dr. Fishman's research has twisting, and Dr. Fishman firmly believes in twisting for osteoporosis. And I can speak to why he thinks that and look at it from a scientific perspective. But also in looking at, okay, so outside of yoga, then there's all this advice that says don't twist. So should you twist or should you not twist? And what does it mean? So here's the deal. There was one research study that was done, and then it became blanket guidelines for everybody all across the board. And there are some really interesting things in that study. And after we're done, I can actually send Shelley links to all of this research too, which I think would be really helpful. I know that when I'm presenting, I'm mentioning things, research that I'm aware of, but I'm not citing particular studies tonight. And I will send Shelley a list with links to all of these studies, because I think that actually having the scientific research to back up what I'm talking about is really important, especially when we're talking about something where there's an argument to look at it both ways. Mm-hmm. There's some research that was done about golfing specifically. Mm. So there were 3 women, I think, out of a group of 5 women, and we're talking about a drive. So we're talking about a strong and powerful twist. So that language, I think, of strong and powerful twist is really important. So 3 women in this study had a compression fracture while mid golf swing. So the drive, you're hitting the ball right off of the tee, right when you first start at a hole. So a strong, powerful twist has the potential to lead to having a compression fracture. I think that that's a really important thing to be aware of, that we're talking strong, powerful twists. And so the guidelines from that study suggested, the actual wording from the study are that people should avoid strong and powerful twists. That somehow became interpreted in mass to avoid, don't twist. If you have osteoporosis, don't twist. I personally believe that if you are concerned about twisting, that you should avoid it. I think safe is always better than sorry. But then coming back to my hands, we're going to talk about this movement a little bit more. So when you picture my hand as 2 vertebrae, so we've talked about that this movement can be too extreme, too much. This movement is protected because we have the spinuous process. But when we look at this movement, what's happening is something really interesting. There is definitely stress that's being put on the spine, but it's happening in an even way. So the stress is evenly distributed throughout the spine when you come into a movement like that. So there's some interesting research outside of Dr. Fishman's research. It's done by a group of Italian scientists. It was some Italian research, and the research is actually kind of gory. They did the research with cadavers. They took bodies and then they inserted sensors into the spine. And then they subjected the spine to different types of movement and they measured the amount of stress that was caused that the sensors were able to pick up on. And what they found is that the movement of twisting definitely creates stress on the spine, but it's significantly less than forward folding. So the reason that that's pertinent to us is it safe to twist or not to twist? If you're concerned, always avoid it. And there are people who should avoid it regardless. People who should avoid it if you have scoliosis. Twisting can aggravate scoliosis. If you happen to have, if you've had, say, vertebroplasty and you have cement in your spine, or if you have a rod, if there's something surgically that's prohibiting movement, there are definitely reasons not to twist. And if it just is something that you're concerned about, I would always say, err on the side of caution. There are other ways to strengthen your spine. We've talked about a few of them tonight already. If you're comfortable with it, know that Dr. Fishman has over 200,000 clinical hours of having people do yoga for osteoporosis in a very specific way. And he has 3 twists in each of his sequences. So he has people twisting in all of those more than 200,000 hours, and he has never had a fracture caused from twisting. So that's what I would say about it. Dr. Fishman believes that the stress that we're putting on the spine is why yoga is so effective and helpful for building bone in the spine. So I would just put that out there and then, do whatever you want with it. If you're not comfortable twisting, know that there are other ways. One of my favorite ways would be to do a combination of doing some yoga and some weight training. And then you absolutely are getting at strengthening your spine, and the weight bearing exercise that you're doing through weights is going to be just as effective or more effective than anything that you would do on the yoga front. Did I confuse anybody? Is that clear as mud?
Yes, that was excellent. Excellent explanation. And one thing that comes to my mind, and I just think, and maybe I'll ask just in the middle because someone else might think this too. Is it possible that the reason that the women fractured from twisting in the golf game, for example, is that they were doing a drive? So it was not just a gradual shift, but an abrupt and almost traumatic kind of movement?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So would you say that is something, that type of thing, that golfing could be problematic for people?
I would say that golfing could definitely be problematic. I would say that if you have osteoporosis and you love golf, I would probably hit your ball really lightly when you tee off, or let somebody else do your drive for you. If you're out there with a friend, let them hit your drive and then work on hitting your ball through the rest of the course in a lighter way.
I like that.
I would definitely say that. I would say because of that research and looking at the drive and golf, I would avoid powerful, hard twisting. When you look at other kinds of twists, they are smaller. And here are some other really interesting things. When you're looking at if someone has had a compression fracture and then they end up in physical therapy after they've had a compression fracture and they're working on safe movement, how do you pick something up off the floor? The physical therapist is going to teach them the hip hinge, which is how I was working on getting down to the floor and then back up. And then the other thing that they're going to teach someone is to use the golfer pickup. And the golfer pickup has a slight twist to it. So let me demonstrate what that looks like.
Sure.
So sometimes I get questions from people like, can I look over my shoulder when I'm driving? Because they're very concerned about twisting as a movement. And my answer is yes, please look over your shoulder. Don't get into a car accident. So that is not going to be a huge twist that's going to cause a problem. So I'm going to bring one of my yoga blocks over here just to demonstrate what this looks like. So coming in, if you were to come in and to do a golfer pickup, and you can actually come in and do a golfer pickup, there's a modified version where you leave your foot down on the floor, and you can also do this same thing where you let your foot slide slightly up. So the golfer pickup, what they're referring to is once somebody's ball has gone in the hole and then the golfer reaches down to pick it up. They tend to do that by bringing one foot forward and one foot back, and then they come into this slight twist to reach down and pick up their ball. So coming into this movement, this is the adapted version where you leave your foot down on the floor. And then the other version would be to just go ahead and let your foot lift up just slightly while you're picking up whatever it is that you have down there. So you'll notice that that movement of coming in, I'm just going to demonstrate from the other side. Hopefully that wasn't a horrible loud crash right by the microphone. But I'm going to have the opposite foot forward and then my other leg back. So this time I'm coming forward to pick this up. So you'll have a physical therapist teach someone to do a movement like this, where you're coming in to pick something up because you're keeping your back from coming into a rounded shape. But you'll notice that coming into that movement, there's a slight twist. So not all twists are created equal. Strong, powerful ones are ones to avoid. If you're using it to keep your back straight and you're coming to pick something up, that, in my opinion, would be something that is a safe, good movement to do.
Okay, good to know. Excellent.
Just
Excellent.
something to think about.
Such helpful tips, really. I mean, everything you said, it's amazing. Just little things that we're always wondering, what about this?
Yes.
Yeah.
What about this? Is this a safe thing to do? Is this
Yeah.
not a safe thing to do?
Yeah.
Those two movements can be used to do a lot of different things. They can be used to, say, move a turkey in and out of the oven at Thanksgiving. um, I would blend the two. Let me just show that. We're coming up on
Yeah.
the holidays. Let's talk
Yes.
about how to do this.
That's a good point. Thanksgiving, some of those turkeys are pretty heavy.
Some of them are really heavy. So I have this chair. It's loaded up with weights. I taught a class earlier today and I used weights from my chair. But let's pretend that we're going to pretend that the chair is an oven. And
Okay.
so we've got to lift something into the oven. So my counter's over here. Honestly, if I were lifting something really heavy, I would actually try and place a chair next to my oven so that I could place it in an intermediate way and get up and down in a safe way. But if I were to do that, so we're going, use your imaginations here with me. Pretend that I have my kitchen counter is here, I have a chair here, and then the chair that's here is going to be our oven. So I'm going to lift what I have here, and then I'm going to bring it down, coming through the hip hinge to place it on the imaginary chair. And then from here, and then using the chair, if you have to use something else to get down, then the chair that's holding your turkey, you could also hold on to the edges and you could bring one leg down. So then from here, I would pick up what I have on the chair and move it into the oven. That's how I would go about making that transfer. And then using your chair, then you can make your way back up to standing. Did I just confuse everybody? Is everybody with me?
Oh, that was awesome.
Using your imagination?
Yeah, everybody got it. I think that was really good, especially having an intermediary step, because some of those I mean, you're picking up a 30-pound bird and it's kind of off kilter. Sometimes feels very unsteady. And so that's
It
great
is.
suggestions.
Those methods can be used for doing lots of things. You could come down and into a very similar position if you were pulling weeds in your garden, or coming into a tabletop position that's keeping your back straight. And I should show, I'm going to grab it really fast. I have this pad, a knee pad. You could pick this up at a garden store. They carry them at garden stores. I got this one at Amazon. But if you're gardening, then placing this underneath your knees and staying in a tabletop position so that you can pull weeds. Or I haul this all over my house and I use it all the time. So if I were going to then move something down to the floor, I'd drop my pad down there first, and then there's something nice to put your knee on.
I love that. That's so smart. Um, I can't help but notice your chair while you're talking. Could you tell us about it?
Yes, I would be happy to tell you about this chair. So this is actually, I have some friends that are physical therapists, and they're a couple, and they're both physical therapists. And she works in the hospital with people who've had fractures, and he does the home health side of things. So he's going to help people after a fracture to be able to do physical therapy at home. And this chair is actually a project of his. He hasn't made the chair, but he found it and he's selling the chairs. So this chair, and looking at things, there are several things posture-wise that we want to pay attention to. When you're sitting, you want your knees to be below your hips whenever possible. It helps to provide better support for your spine, and it's easier to stay in an upright position. So this chair is designed where it drops your legs down and your hips are above your knees. But then in addition to that, it has this split back so that when you come back into this chair, it's providing support for your spine so that you're not coming into a rounded shape. So he found it's the chair that my physical therapist friends recommend and found. And if you'd like me to send you that information, I can also send you that.
I bet everybody, I even see someone wrote the same question.
Yes, yes. This chair with its split back is physical therapist picked to support good posture.
That's excellent. And getting back a little bit to the poses,
Please.
What other poses have you had to change, Sarah, in order to adapt them for osteoporosis?
Okay, so we can get into the whole discussion about poses to adapt and then poses that I think are specifically designed for osteoporosis. Which direction do you want to look at first? Do you want to look at what this looks like to have, how to adapt?
Yeah, I think so. I don't, how many of you could give me a thumbs up on what you'd like to, would you say that would be as valuable? Because we're often in a class and people don't know anything about osteoporosis. So
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
definitely.
So yes, for sure. Let's talk about some things to adapt. There are some poses that I see people commonly do, but the one point that I would want to say is please don't be frightened of yoga from the poses that I'm going to show. They're poses that are commonly done in a class, and then I'm going to show what you can do instead. But know that you don't have to be able to move like that to be able to have yoga be helpful for bone health. I seriously, I work with people who don't get down to the floor. And there are ways to adapt yoga in ways that are really good for bone health. And that teacher list, find somebody who knows what they're doing too. But I'm going to come down to the floor and I'm going to show some really common poses and some things that you can do instead. And also some ways to maintain your mobility. So I'm going to make my way back down to the floor in a safe way. And I'm going to grab a yoga strap. You could also use a resistance band if you happen to have one of those handy and around at home. I'm going to set the strap next to me. And then from here, so where we talked about the poses that you wouldn't do, so I'm going to come in and I'm going to do a forward fold that you would never want to do. So I'm going to show first what you should avoid, and then I'm going to show what to do instead. So for this particular pose, don't do this. Don't reach forward towards your toes. And this is an important thing to consider in your life in general. We don't want to come forward in a way where we're rounding to reach forward for our toes. but people still want to work on flexibility and mobility. And we talked a lot about the hip hinge and being able to bend your knees and then fold from the hip in a way that you can keep your back straight. And one of the things that's important to consider when you want to keep your back straight, you have to have some mobility through your hamstrings. Our hamstrings are the big muscles that run along the back of your leg. They actually go from up. Your hamstrings are going to run all the way down the back of your leg, from your glutes to just below your knee.
Okay.
And that muscle, if that muscle is tight, it will make it so that it's really hard to come into a hip hinge safely. So we want to stretch our hamstrings because it allows us to move safely. So there's a reason why some amount of flexibility and mobility is important. I'm going to come all the way down to the floor onto my back, and notice how I'm doing that, because you can actually do this safely when you're getting in and out of bed too. You want to come down onto your side, and then from here, roll over onto your back. So what I'm about to show is how to stretch your hamstrings safely with osteoporosis. So I have a yoga strap here, and I'm going to put a foot in here. And then I'm going to take my foot out in front of me. There are a lot of different levels with this. Many of the people that I work with, flexibility is a really big issue. The ideal version of this is going to look something like this, where you're bringing your leg straight up and you can feel the stretch on the back of your leg and your other leg is extended. But it's okay if your leg is slightly bent, and it's okay if your leg is way far out in front of you. The important part is that you want to feel this stretch on the back of your leg. So this stretch you want to feel this on the back of your leg, and that will actually help you to be able to have more mobility through your spine to stretch these muscles. So whether your leg is way up here or way up here, that part doesn't matter, just so long as you're feeling this. So what you'll notice is that my back is flat on the ground. So there's no, even if I were to bring my leg way far up here, if you have crazy flexibility and you can bring your leg way up there, it's a safe way to do this because my back is still straight and protected on the floor. So that's one thing that I would show about adapting things.
That's great. That's great. So using that belt.
Yes, using the belt. The belt is really a helpful thing. And if you don't happen to have a yoga strap and you wanted to try something like that out, you could use a hand towel. You could use a soft belt, maybe the strap off of your bathrobe. You can even use an old tie. If your husband has a tie you don't like, that can work. So there are a lot of options. Another pose that's something that I see commonly done in a yoga class is to come into something called pigeon pose. Okay. So if you come into pigeon pose, somebody has their leg out in front of them like this. Let me show what it looks like both directions. So to come into pigeon pose, you have your leg out in front like this, and then you take your other leg back behind you. And then I'm going to show the upside down pigeon after that. So from here, somebody's got their leg back behind them and they're sitting like this, and this is a stretch through your hips. There are other stretches and other ways to stretch through the hips. This one is not necessary. And then something that you'll commonly see happen from here is then that people walk their arms out and then you bring your forehead down to the floor. This would be something I would avoid with osteoporosis. I would not choose to do that. But there is a pose I would do instead. And this is a pose that you can do in class. You can just tell you, if your teacher asks about it, your teacher will probably know if they see you do this. The next pose is figure 4, or it's often referred to as the upside down pigeon. So to come into the upside down pigeon, and I'm going to face this way so that you can see what's going on. I'm going to come down onto my side and then onto my back. So from here, this is a version of that same stretch. And this is actually a really helpful pose to do with osteoporosis because, in my opinion, It's the pose that allows you to safely tie your shoes.
Ah,
So
okay.
bring your foot across your knee, and then from here, there are different variations of this. You might choose to take a hand and to push your thigh out to the side. So you're getting this same stretch that I just showed in the other direction, but it's upside down. So this is a way to adapt this pose. And then you have the option to interlace your hands behind your left, well, I have my right knee out, so I'm behind my left thigh, but it can be whichever leg you have. And then as you draw your legs closer towards you, your back is still straight and flat, so you're getting the stretch through the hips, and then you have the option to even press against the leg that's out to the side, causing more of a stretch through the hip. So being able to tie your shoes safely with osteoporosis is a really important thing. When you talk about a lot of different things you can do if tying shoes is a challenging thing. But this particular pose and being able to get at your foot and keep your back straight, practicing this in a laying down position, whether you practice it on the floor or laying down in bed, then it makes it so that when it's time to tie your shoes, you can do it in a safe way and keep your back from coming into a rounded shape. So that's something that I think is a really important and helpful thing. We want to have some mobility through our hips because that mobility through our hips allows us to move without coming into a rounded shape.
I know there's been a lot of questions, and so I'm just going to ask you a couple of them.
Please.
I know, because we're getting to be time, but
I'm sorry.
it's just so good. I don't want it to. What about downward dog? Is that something we should avoid?
No, not necessarily. I don't frequently teach downward facing dog, but you can absolutely do it. I just ditched my socks and let's talk about downward facing dog.
Okay.
Okay, so there would be, in my opinion, a safe way to get into downward facing dog with osteoporosis. And that would be to do it from a tabletop position. I'm going to show some things that I would do and not do with downward facing dog. So from your tabletop position, tuck under both sets of toes and then lift your hips up towards the sky. So you'll notice that my back is straight. And this is totally safe and an a-okay thing to do with downward facing dog. So this is an okay thing to do. If you're tempted to round your spine, it's okay to lift your heels up. And it's okay to even bend your knees. The part that's not okay would be to round your spine. So steps would be coming into downward facing dog. You want to have your back straight, even if your knees are bent. And then work on straightening your legs and then work on pushing heels down to the floor. Oftentimes you'll see, coming from downward facing dog and then people step forward like this. Well, guess what just happened? I rounded my spine. So I would not do something like that. I would come from downward facing dog back down to a tabletop position.
So would you say, Sarah, that being in a tabletop position is a good start for a lot of positions that you want to get to? And also, I like the way you showed us how to get down on the floor safely. Because, with one knee at a time, and then also turning over to show how you get down to get into bed. Yeah, I loved that. It was excellent. May I ask you a couple of other questions that
absolutely.
Someone asked about the hip hinge. Are you supposed to stick your tail end out as you're doing that all the time?
I think so.
Okay. Okay.
I think that you should stick your bottom out because I think let's look at hip mobility. So you don't have to stick your bottom out in order to do that. But I think when you stick your bottom out, that it becomes really easy to consciously think about what you're doing. So when we talked about sun salutations earlier and we talked about stopping at a flat back, essentially this is a hip hinge. I'm coming over this far to a point where my back is straight. But then when we're talking about coming through the hip hinge, when I come into a hip hinge, I typically step my feet out slightly wider than hip width apart. The reason for that is that when you take your legs out a little bit wider, it makes it easier to fold from the hip and keep your back straight. So then you also want to bend your knees, and when you do that, you'll notice that my knees are tracking out over the middle of my feet. They're not dropping in, they're not way out. You want them to come out over the middle of your feet. That helps to protect your knees. So coming into the hip hinge, bend your knees and stick your behind out. Stick it out. That's also going to work your glutes, and having strong glutes provides good support for our spines. So coming into this position where you stick your behind out, then that makes it so that you can pick something up off the floor. You probably noticed me doing that every time I set the microphone down tonight. I'm coming through the hip hinge. And then from there, you could also adapt the hip hinge and bring one leg down.
And then the other pose where you do lean over, but one leg back.
Coming in like this, coming into the golfer pickup?
Yes. Yes, I liked that too.
Yes.
Very good. Okay, someone asked, when you were talking about the 12 to 40 second Dr. Fishman hold, does that apply to the hip or forearm bones? Is a question. I don't know.
Yes. Okay. So there are, with Dr. Fishman's published research, he has 12 poses that have been part of published research. And then there are another 24 poses that I think will be published next year. Okay. So the 12 to 40 second window applies to all of those poses. That's a bone building window.
Okay. All right.
Some poses, let's talk briefly about, oh my goodness, I could keep everybody here for weeks. I love talking about this stuff, and there's just so much there. But let's talk briefly about, we talked a lot about things that we could do to strengthen the spine tonight, but let's talk briefly about some things that we can do to strengthen our hips. So our hips, with all forms of exercise, whether you're looking at the Lift More study or there's such a huge body of research that's been done about osteoporosis. The spine is relatively easy to strengthen. So when we talked tonight about the hidden statistics and how compression fractures can be quite serious because of the pressure that they put on our internal organs that are in our rib cage, when you're looking at strengthening the body, it's a whole lot easier. The good news is that it's a whole lot easier to strengthen your spine than it is to strengthen the hips. The hips are a difficult area to get at. So when we're talking about fractures, the most common fracture that happens with osteoporosis are compression fractures in the spine. But the next most common fractures are hip and femur fractures. So your thigh bone and your hip bone, that would be the next part. And then there's this little bone that connects our thigh bone into the hip bone, and it comes around. And that little rounded part is the femoral neck. And the femoral neck is a really common place for fractures, and it's also a really difficult area to strengthen. So I wanted to talk just briefly about the tools that we have that we can use to strengthen our hips. It's not perfect. It's still easier to strengthen your spine than your hips, whether you're doing yoga or weight training or anything else. That's just an unfortunate truth. But the things that we can do that work on strengthening our hips, balance is actually a wonderful way to strengthen your hips. Anytime you pick one foot up off of the ground, so something like tree pose would be a really good thing coming here from looking at things for our hips. And the reason for that, coming back to our hip hinge, I'm going to scooch my yoga strap out of the way. The reason for that is that anytime you pick one foot up off the ground, whether you're coming into something like tree pose or not, when you've picked one foot up completely off the ground. You're loading weight into your standing leg hip. And then when you do that same thing, you're loading weight into the standing leg hip on the other side. So that's one way to strengthen your hips. Another way to strengthen your hips is to do glute work. So things like squats. So, ooh, let's hip hinge, but then we're going to do it 10 times. So when we do it, instead of just as getting up and down, then we're working on strengthening our glutes in a way that's going to also strengthen hips. Other things that we can do to strengthen our hips, so lots of squats, coming in and doing lots of squats with and without weights. That's something that's going to be really helpful. And then here's something else that gets a really bad rap, I think, in the world of bone health, but it helps our hips, and that's walking. So looking at walking specifically, walking is an interesting thing to consider with bone health. There are numerous studies that show that walking doesn't do anything for the spine. So walking is good aerobic exercise. It's a wonderful way to get your vitamin D. Nutrition is a whole nother topic, but there are many benefits to walking. Walking is not helpful for the spine, but there are also studies that show that walking quickly for a period of at least, say, 45 minutes, that is good for your hips. And it's difficult to get at this area to strengthen. So that would be my 2 cents about the hips.
Oh, that's wonderful. I never knew that. I wonder what pace you have to keep up your walking to do that.
So that is an interesting thing to consider. Everybody's walking pace is going to be a little bit different. And what I would say is brisk walking. So walking quickly for you, whatever that happens to be, and then working on having that be a little bit faster and a little bit faster. But walking is good for our hips, not our spine, but it's good for our hips.
Okay. Now let me see. I probably can just pick one more question because I'm keeping you too long, but I could talk to you for about 3 hours, I think,
Oh, yeah.
or longer. All night, probably. Let's see. Um, is it safe to do the bridge pose if you have a fracture?
Oh my goodness, I'm so glad somebody asked that question. Yes, let's talk about bridge pose. Bridge pose is a wonderful pose. Bridge pose is among Dr. Fishman's that he's studied. And then also bridge pose is something that I learned some really specific cues when I did my BoneFit training. So let's talk about bridge pose.
Okay.
We're going to come back down to the floor for this one. Coming back through my hip hinge. And then we're going to make our way down to the floor. I'm going to come down again onto my side and then mindfully over onto my back. So in a regular yoga class, you'll often, let's talk about what not to do, and then we're going to talk about what to do. So often in a regular yoga class, you'll hear a cue to lower your spine one vertebrae at a time. Don't do that with osteoporosis. You can absolutely do bridge pose with the rest of the class, but don't do it that way. What you want to do instead, you want to bring your arms out to your sides, generally at about a 45-degree angle. Press the back of your head straight down into the floor. So you don't want to be turning and looking at the teacher or your neighbor. Ooh, their bridge is higher than mine. No. You want to press the back of your head straight down into the floor. This is going to anchor your pose and create stability for your spine. And then the next thing that you want to do is actually to press your shoulders into the floor. So pressing the back of your head and your shoulders into the floor. And then from here, lift your hips up. And this becomes a BoneFit bridge. This is a safe pose to do. It strengthens your glutes. It puts good stress through your spine. And it's a wonderful thing to do for osteoporosis. This is a safe pose to do post-fracture. This is a really wonderful thing to do.
Oh, thank you.
Then when it's time to come back down, bring yourself straight down. None of this one vertebrae at a time stuff.
No, that's really helpful. Let's see. Let's see. I guess one thing I'd like to say is that I am so grateful for the way that you do what you do. You have had like an enormous impact on me already just from watching you in your videos. And I really appreciate that you took the time tonight to come and speak to OsteoBoston. And but I want to applaud you for all your work with osteoporosis people. And I want to ask you, what brought you to that? How did
Oh
you
my
end up
goodness.
in that
Yeah.
capacity that you wanted to learn more about it?
This for me is really personal. My grandma lived with me for the last 10 years of her life. And during that time, she had two hip fractures. I come from a family with multiple generations of women who have had osteoporosis and fractures. I know personally how devastating and life-changing fractures can be. And when I did this with my grandma, I didn't know that there was anything that you could do to prevent fracture. I didn't know about safe movement. Nobody told my grandma that there was anything that she should be doing. It was, here, take some calcium. There wasn't anything
So true.
to help her. And after my grandma passed away, when I had the opportunity to do some yoga teacher training, that was for me the first time in my life that I realized that anything could be done to help bone health and to improve things. I had some wonderful teachers. One of my teachers was a physical therapist, and she mentioned Dr. Fishman's research in passing. And then she was teaching us what we should do if we had someone who came to our class, and I have no idea. I doubt that most yoga teachers probably know what you should do if you have someone with osteoporosis in your class.
I know.
But my teacher was a physical therapist. And so she taught us what you should do if you have someone in your class who has osteoporosis. And I sat in a room full of 30 people thinking to myself, there's something you can do about this. My life changed in that moment. It was then that I knew I needed to learn everything that I could. And I knew I wanted to help people to improve their bone health and to move safely.
Yes. Well, that's awesome. That's awesome. We're so glad you did, Sarah. So glad you did. And thank you for your time tonight with us. I really appreciate it. Now, I'd love to have you back.
I
Honestly,
would love
we didn't
to.
even start to talk about things I want to know more about from you. So,
Oh my goodness, I would be happy to do this again.
oh, that would be
I'm
wonderful.
happy to talk about it if there's one person that wants to hear about it.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And well, we will talk again then. I'm really happy you were able to come tonight. So
Absolutely.
thanks so
Thank
much.
you, everybody. This is such a privilege to get
Well,
to do with you.
it's
Thank
a
you.
privilege to have you. I'm so grateful. So I know there were more questions, but I guess I want to say uh, we'll have to get you next time. Okay. And thanks for
Where
getting up
can we
tonight,
find
Sarah.
her? Does she have
Oh,
class?
yes, that's a great question. Where can we find you? Is it sarahmapes.com?
So I have a website. It's saramapes.co with just the CO rather than
Oh,
the com.
okay.
And then also I have a YouTube channel that's called the Bone Builder System.
Okay. And I spell Sarah with an H because of
Yes,
that, sarahmapes.co and
saramapes.co and the Bone Builder System.
in the bone builder system. I'll write that down too. Oh, thank you. Bone builders system. I've been following that. So, oh,
Yes,
yes.
yes.
Well,
Well,
thank
thank you
you.
so much. Have a wonderful evening, everybody. This
Thank you,
was such a
Sarah.
privilege.
Thank you very much. All right, folks. Thank you for getting on, everyone. Let's go to our second half of our program.